We've taken care of all of the prerequisites as well as the layout of our game, which already looks pretty decent. So we can now start thinking about the functionality of our game. Before we can start implementing the code, we will need some properties in our ViewController class. We will define them right below our outlets and above the ViewDidLoad method. I'll begin with a variable called currentPlayer, which gets the initial value of 0. This property will contain information about which player's turn it is currently, so that we can use it to properly update our scores later on. The scores is what we are going to define next as a variable called scores, which will be set, since we have a 2-player game, to an integer array with 2 entries, both initially being 0, obviously, since no player has yet gotten any points at the beginning of our game. Now, these are the properties for our players, as well as scores. And we will now need some properties for our colors and color sequences that we need for our game. I'll begin with a variable called sequenceIndex, initially set to 0, and we will later on use this property to check where in our sequence we currently are and flash the next button accordingly. Other than that, I will need 2 more integer arrays, one being called color sequence, which I will initialize as an empty integer array, and another variable colors to tab, also initialized as an empty integer array. Now both these arrays will later on contain the same information, but we will use the color sequence to play back our sequence with the buttons, while colors to tab will contain a copy of the current color sequence, which the user has to reproduce by tapping the buttons in the right order. Now, why exactly we need 2 arrays for this will be much clearer when we actually get to implementing the according parts in our app. That's all for our properties for now. And I now want to start off in the create new game method, where we need to add a few things. As of now, we've only set the title for our action button and reduced the opacity for the color buttons. Now all of that can stay the way it is, but we want to add 2 more things to this method. First, we want to set the isEnabled property on our action button to true to make sure that we can use it. Later on, when playing the game, we will temporarily disable this button, but when a new game should be started, we will of course need to use it, so we'll re-enable it with the call of this method. For the color buttons, on the other hand, it is the exact opposite. When we are in the state of our game where we can start a new round, we should not be able to use our color buttons, since they should only be used during the actual gameplay. Therefore, I will, inside of the for loop, after setting the alpha value, also add button.isEnabled and set it to false to disable our buttons. And we will only later in the game re-enable them when we actually need to use them. Now we have already declared our color sequence array, which again will hold the sequence that is shown and that the user needs to reproduce. Naturally, whenever we start a new game, this should be reset. So let's add color sequence.removeAll right at the top of the create new game method to remove every entry from the array. And we can start our game from scratch. But how do we actually start a new game? I've already said that we're going to use our action button. So the functionality to start a new game obviously needs to be placed in our action button handler method down here. This gets invoked every time the action button is tapped. As of now, we only had a print statement, which we can now delete, and instead start off by resetting our sequence index property to the value 0. Now this index needs to be 0 at the very beginning of our game, but also after each completed round, since for the next round, our sequence should start over from the beginning. After resetting the index, I want to continue by updating the action button itself and begin by setting a title for my new action button with action button .set title, and I will pass memorize for the title and a control state normal, since when we now press the action button, our color sequence will start to play. And we want to tell the user that she or he has to memorize the sequence now. We now want to use our action button, kind of like an info label. And in this case, we do not want to be able to use our button. Therefore, I will add action button .is enabled and set it to false. Which is why for our create new game method, we had to re-enable it. However, at this stage of our game, when the sequence starts to play, we do not only want to disable the action button, but basically all of the user interaction that is possible. So also our color buttons. I could add another for loop for the buttons here, but I can also globally disable the interaction for my view controller by writing view.isUserInteraction enabled and set it to false, which will disable all interaction with this view and all of its subviews, meaning all the UI elements that we've added to our game. I have now taken care of everything I had to start a new round. But what do I want to do when starting a new round? Well, first of all, I want to add one new color to my color sequence. And afterwards, I want to play back my current color sequence so that the user is able to memorize it. We will use two new methods for that. One being called addNewColor, which is defined here without parameters or return values. This method will just add one new color to our color sequence array, and then another method that will be called playSequence, also with no parameters, no return values, which will flash our color buttons in the order of our color sequence array, so that the user is able to memorize them. Now I want to call both these methods from our action button handler down here to actually start the round. The addNewColor method will be called without any special annotations by writing its name. For the playSequence method, I will do it slightly different. I don't want the sequence to immediately start when our button was tapped, but instead, I want to have a short delay after button tap, so our player has a little time to get ready. Now, some of you may already know how we can achieve this in Swift. I'm going to use a dispatch queue for that. To do so, all I need to do is write dispatch queue.main, which is just the main queue of our application. And then I add async after. I will then look for the method with the deadline and execute parameters. The deadline meaning when I want to execute something, and for the execute parameter, I can add the code I want to execute. Now if I hit return, I can, for my deadline, specify .now, which is the current time, and then add .seconds with a 1 in parentheses. So that's basically what will delay my following code by 1 second. If I hit return on the execute parameter field, I can just pass the code I want to execute here, which in our case is the playSequence method. Since we are in a closure block here, I will have to prepend self in front of the method call by writing self.playSequence, which then will call my method exactly 1 second after the button was tapped. This completes our action button handler method. We can now proceed to our two new methods, which we called from the button handler. We will begin with the addNewColor method, which will be pretty simple. In fact, we have built our app in a way that we won't actually pass UI colors, but instead only integer values between 0 and 3, which stand for the tags of our 4 different color buttons. So all that I have to write in the addNewColor method is color sequence.append to add a new number to my color sequence array, which should be randomized between 0 and 3. In Swift, I can use the arg4random_uniform method for that, though I do have to cast its result explicitly to an integer value. Next, I need to pass an unsigned integer 32 to my method, so let's write new int 32 with the argument 4, which will give us a random number between 0 and 3. And therefore, if I look at the complete line, we'll add such a value to my color sequence array each time the addNewColor method is called. Now I want to play our current color sequence, and this will be implemented in our playSequence method. But before we start playing the sequence, the first thing I want to do is check whether our current index is still a valid index for the color sequence array. By writing if sequence index is less than color sequence.count, meaning if this index is bigger, it will not be contained in the color sequence array, meaning that this round is completed and we'll continue with our game. If the index is valid, I want to flash the appropriate button and also increment the index. Incrementing the index is pretty simple. We can just write sequence index plus equal 1. To flash our button, I want to create another custom method, which I will define right below our playSequence method. It will be called flash with a parameter button of type circular button, which means that we can just pass one of our buttons to this method and it will then flash. I will then in the playSequence method call flash before incrementing my index. And for the button parameter, I will pass color buttons, which is the array containing all of our 4 buttons. And the index will be color sequence at sequence index. Now this might look a bit confusing, but it's actually fairly simple. I have my color buttons array, and I want to get the appropriate button to flash. To do so, I will retrieve the current number from my color sequence array, which always will be between 0 and 3. And that's pretty much all we need to add in the if part of the statement. So let's continue by adding the else part. Again, this will be executed whenever our index is bigger than the maximum index of our color sequence array. And therefore, we need to finish this round and enable the player to reproduce the played sequence. I will now populate our colors to tab array by setting it to the current content of the color sequence array. We will later on use our colors to tab array to one entry after the other, check if the user tapped the correct button. To actually enable our user to tap the buttons, I will have to re-enable the user interaction by writing view.isUserInteractionEnabled and setting it to true. I will also once more use my action button as an info label by setting its title to tap the circles. For control state normal, so that our user has the appropriate instructions for what to do. I will also add a for loop for our color buttons with for button in color buttons. And for each button, set the isEnabled property will be true, so that our user is actually able to use the buttons. Now, before we get into implementing our color button handler method, I want to complete this step by adding the contents of our flash method. But what exactly is our goal here with this method? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Over a short period of time, I want to increase the alpha value of the button to 1 and then reset it to 0.5 to kind of mimic the look of a button tab so that the user is able to memorize the sequence. To animate something over time, I can, in the UI framework, use a predefined method of UIView, which is called animate. So let's type UIView.animate And I now want to choose this method with the duration, animations, and completion parameters. With this method, I can specify what should be animated over which time period, and finally, what should be done as soon as the animation finishes. For the duration, I'll use half a second, so 0.5. While the animation field is selected, we can just hit return and then specify what we want to animate. Again, I want to increase the button's alpha value to 1.0 and then decrease it back to 0.5. And I could just add this here in two separate lines by writing button.alpha is set to 1.0 and then button.alpha is set to 0.5. What's missing is the completion, where I can again hit return for this parameter, which we won't really need. I'll just type bool, and as soon as our animation is finished, I can execute some code here. And I will just call self.playSequence to come back to our playSequence method, where we will either flash another button, provided the sequence is valid, or if not, we'll just finish our round and enable the user interaction. Let's run the application once more to see if this works. And if it does, we should, after tapping on our action button, start a new game where one button will flash, and afterwards we should get the information, tap the circuit, and should be able to use our color buttons. Our app starts, and if I now tap on start game, I can see that after a second a button flashes, in this case the red one. I can now see the information, tap the circuit at the bottom, and as you can see, I'm now able to use my color buttons again. Now, of course, so far nothing is happening when I tap on them, but that's what we are going to take care of next.